Alright, did you guys all know that every 60 seconds, 50 people die from LSD? No, I'm just kidding. But today I'm going to talk about MK Ultra and how the CIA did unethical experiments from the 1950s through the 1970s. I did a project on this when I was in 11th grade, so I'm pretty familiar with it. So first I'll talk about how the Cold War led to LSD testing. Then I'll talk about the most interesting experiment. Last, I'll talk about the 3 victims of these experiments. So on to my first point. The Cold War led the CIA to test LSD in unethical ways. How many of you have heard of MK Ultra? Well, that's what the whole CIA's project was called. First, I'll talk about how the US government's fear of the communists. Then I'll talk about how they tested certain things. And lastly, I'll talk about how this led to LSD testing. First, the government feared communists were using mind control on prisoners of war in Korea. Alan Dulles was the director of the CIA, and he gave permission for research on psychological warfare. This research went out to universities, as well as prisons and a lot of private institutions within the CIA. And these experiments were done on, a lot of them were prisoners, and a lot of them were volunteers who didn't really know what they were volunteering for. And a lot of them were civilians and also just some CIA members. They get tested within the community and whether they knew it or not. And then this led to electroshock therapy and drug testing. There's one story where these army men, or these soldiers, they volunteered to go for an experiment, and they ended up going into a room and they had sarin dropped on all their arms, which is a poison, and a certain amount of it can kill you, and they all went crazy in this room, and it turns out the experiment was to find out the lethal amount of sarin. And another thing is they would shock people in psychiatric hospitals, and then they would play recordings over and over, and then they would put them to sleep for months, hoping that they would be able to erase their memory. And another thing, according to History.com, an Atlanta prison had an experiment where they gave 8 prisoners hallucinogenics, and they didn't know what they had taken, and they were all going pretty crazy. Then this all led to the CIA testing LSD. So this was the idea of Sidney Gottlieb, who led LSD research. He was a poison expert for the CIA. Sidney thought it could be used for brainwashing and psychedelic torture. The CIA began to fund studies at Stanford and Columbia University, which then led to all kinds of different experiments throughout the country. I just went over what drove the CIA to start MK Ultra, some of their experiments, and how they shifted their focus to LSD. Now I'll get on to my second point, which is that the CIA used prostitutes to lure in victims to experiment on. How many of you have heard of Project MK Ultra? No, I'm sorry, Project Midnight Climax. Well, yeah, believe it or not, it's not the name of a porno, but the name of a CIA experiment. I talked about, so this experiment is pretty interesting. I want to talk about why they did it and how they did it and what it is. So first, I'll talk about what it is, and it was they wanted to lure in people to test LSD on, and they figured that they could just find average Johns off the street this way. And so it took place in San Francisco. It was targeted towards LSD research, and it involved random men who had no idea what was going on. They wanted to see how people would act on LSD in different situations, and it seems like it was kind of just an excuse for these CIA guys to party behind a 2-way mirror and go crazy. And according to Darian Kavanaugh, they had bad reasons for doing this, and the project ended up being unsuccessful. The CIA members seemed like were on too much acid to come up with good ideas, which led to them coming up with really crazy ideas like this. And then they did it by using a 2-way mirror, and they would be on the other side of it while watching the whole thing go down, and the prostitute would go in there with a drink, and it would be laced with LSD, and the guy would drink it, and then the men would just be taking notes and drinking cocktails on the other side of the wall, watching it, probably on LSD too. So I just explained what Project Midnight Climax was, why they did it, and how they did it. Now on to my third and final point, which is where I'll talk about 3 victims of these experiments. So just so you guys kind of get a feel for what it was like for them, I put a tablet of LSD under all your tables for you to try. No, I'm just kidding. But I'm going to talk about Frank Olson, Harold Blower, and Ruth Kelly. Frank Olson, so he worked for the CIA and then he wanted out, and that was right after he was secretly dosed with LSD at the very beginning of all of this research. He ended up falling out of a window 9 days after, and the government actually gave his family $700,000 out of a court settlement. And they made a Netflix documentary about this man. And then Howard Blall, he was a tennis player, and he checked into a psychiatric institute for depression, and right as he was getting better and about to leave, they started doing extra testing on him, and they were just injecting him with random things, and one of them ended up killing him. And according to Francis Wolff, it was covered up until several years later, and his family they sued and also received a settlement of $700,000. And the last victim was Ruth Kelly. She was singing in a bar in San Francisco when her drink was slipped right before her show, and she ended up going crazy right after the show. She made it through the show. She went to a hospital, and it turned out the guy who laced her drink was the guy who was in charge of Project Midnight Climax. So to summarize, I just talked about Frank Olson, Harold Blower, and Ruth Kelly. That concludes my main points. And to review, I talked about how the government researched psychological warfare, Project Midnight Climax, and 3 victims. I'm sure that you'd all agree that the CIA went through very unethical tests during this time, and if there's one thing I want you to take away from this, it's that you should never trust a mirror. Thank you.